Hi, my name's Michael. I'm one of the owners here at DCanter, a wine boutique in Washington, D.C., where I teach a number of wine classes to wine lovers all throughout the city. Today I'm going to be walking through how you can glean a lot of information about what is inside a wine bottle just based on the label itself. And if you're like me, you spent most of your initial wine buying days judging purely on the label. But you'll be glad to know that wine professionals and expert drinkers who have been doing this for a long time judge by the label as well. It just happens that they might be looking at something a little bit different. What I have here are actually three wines that are very similar. They're all Cabernet Sauvignons, and they're all about the same age, but the labels are distinctly different. And if you look at them, it might be a little confusing to figure out what's similar and what's different about them. The first one is Cabernet Sauvignon from Chile. Now, the label is very simple in that it's done like a lot of New World wines. And when I say New World, I mean pretty much every place outside of Europe. And what it has is simply the name of the winery, the type of grape, Cabernet Sauvignon, the vintage, 2010, and then this little word, Reserva, on there. Now, what this tells me is exactly what I just said. Points A, B, and C, you're done. It seems that simple. It also tells me a little something that might be somewhat more subtle. The first is that it actually says something more than Chile. It mentions a very small, very specific wine growing region. And once you get to know wine, and once you are able to examine it a little bit more closely, you'll notice that this is not one of the big primary wine growing regions of Chile. So the winemaker here has made the specific choice of mentioning this very tiny, very small appellation within Chile. And that is a specific choice to say this wine has specific qualities that are different than other Cabernet Sauvignons that you will receive from Chile. And as I smell it and I taste it, it actually does taste a little bit different than I might expect. A typical Cabernet Sauvignon is going to be big, it's going to be fruity, it's going to have some nice big tannins that make your cheeks pucker. But when I taste this one, it's got this interesting little bit of salinity at the end, like a little bit of kind of what you might smell in kind of a salty marsh. And when I look at the map and when I examine exactly where this place is, I notice that it actually is very close to the ocean, to the Pacific Ocean, and that there are these sea breezes that come in and affect the grapes. Now, that's a little tough to know without a lot of background and research, but it is information that's conveyed that the winemaker hopes that you'll be able to understand from the label in the limited amount of room that's on there. As a general rule, you can kind of make the assumption that the smaller the piece of land that is identified on the label, the more specific the attributes are going to be, the more distinct that wine is going to be. So if it simply says California, yes, it's probably going to be true to its character. It's going to taste like a Cabernet Sauvignon should, but it might be largely indistinguishable from other California Cabernet Sauvignons, and maybe even other Chilean or Argentinian Cabernet Sauvignons that use very broad appellations like Chile, like Argentina. What stands in contrast is this next bottle that I have. It's from Bordeaux, and it's a little bit more complicated on the label, but once again, it conveys a lot of information if you've done a lot of background research and have the time and the wherewithal to learn exactly what some of these indicators mean. The first is in the biggest lettering, Pessac Léognan. It's a very small sub-appellation within Bordeaux. And this tells me a couple things. One, it is defining specific attributes. Because it's from that smaller area, the winemaker is saying this is more, it's unique and it's different than something you would get if it just said Bordeaux on the front. Also, it implies something. If one knows that this is on a certain bank of a river, specifically the left bank, it's going to be, more often than not, more Cabernet Sauvignon than anything else. Now, you kind of have to know that the French style of making wine generally means that most of the wines are going to be blends of some sort. In Bordeaux, that usually means a blend of Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and maybe a few other grapes as well. But in this specific region, with this name of the appellation, it actually has much more Cabernet Sauvignon in it than other grapes. And we know that because French law in this specific region dictates that. Admittedly, that takes a lot of study, and it takes a lot of reading, and it takes a lot of experience with wine drinking and wine knowledge, but the information is there. Something else I would point out is that this specific bottle tells me that it was bottled on the property and that the fruit was actually grown in the vineyards owned by the winery. And that implies, even to a further extent, that the winemaker feels that his specific property carries characteristics and offers something that is even more defined than this broader region that is identified on the label. And as I pour it out, just by looking at it, in comparison to the previous Cabernet Sauvignon that I poured, it's much darker in color. It's much richer. It doesn't necessarily mean it's better. It doesn't mean it's worse. It just means it's different and is specific from the other. And as I smell it, it comes across as quite distinct from the first wine. It's got a much earthier quality, which, true enough, is fairly standard for most Bordeaux's. You do expect to have an earthier, more rustic quality than you do from New World wines. And as I taste it, it's interesting. Vanilla notes come across, mintiness, and some of that comes from the specific soils that are grown in this area, also from some of the winemaking traditions that one associates with Bordeaux, which is significant oak aging and sometimes a little bit underripe fruit. But this one specifically is very well developed, has very rich flavors. Lastly, something that gets even more complicated is another French wine. It's from an area in the southern part of France, in the Languedoc, and it is also a Cabernet Sauvignon. What's interesting about this label is, once again, one who's studied wine and knows a little bit about the regions and what types of grapes are typically allowed in specific regions, will recognize that Cabernet Sauvignon is not typical of this region. That also explains why the appellation that is listed is a very big, very large appellation, because France and other old world European countries have very specific rules about what grapes can be grown in specific regions. And when a winemaker wants to do something different, feels that a specific grape, in this case Cabernet Sauvignon, will work very well in his vineyard, he has to use a broader name, a broader appellation, which, as I mentioned before, the rule of thumb is that the smaller the appellation, the more specific, the more unique that type of wine is. This kind of goes in the other direction. This is a winemaker that has used a much broader, larger area, partially because the law tells him he has to, but also because it gives him the freedom to try different grapes that he might not otherwise get to experiment with. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, but when a winemaker does that, when they try something different that is outside the normal rules and regulations of the old world countries, oftentimes that's where you find your best values, because you're not paying for a very famous name and appellation, but you are getting high quality fruit because the winemaker has he's learned through experience that he can make a great wine by not sticking to the norms and the traditions. So you usually find that younger winemakers, more experimental winemakers are doing this. And because they don't have that big name, you can get a really great wine for a much lower price point. And in fact, as I try this wine again, I find it remarkably distinct from these others. It very much stands up on its own. It's a different style, but equally enjoyable to some of these others. That's a lot of information, and I definitely said a number of times, go back and study geography and learn some of these rules. But I hope it gives you a clue and gives you an idea of what you need to look for and why some of these appellations and these geographies become important in the wine world. And that the more you learn about them, the more you understand them, and the more that you appreciate which grapes are grown in which regions and the traditions of those regions, the more information you can glean from the label of a bottle.